Today's scripture, digs deep into both the history of the early church, as well as it digs deep into some of the pain and questions for the current church. If you had a hard time following all that, it's okay. There's a lot packed in the scripture, and Paul has a way of writing that sometimes is a little hard to follow. So give yourself some grace. Remember Saul, who became Paul? When he was still Saul, he was a very faithful Jew. Now, sometimes it's hard for me to connect with all the rules that come in the Jewish church. So let's think about him instead as a very faithful church member. He attends church every Sunday. Every special service. He could tell you the very few times that he wasn't there and why. He always wears a suit to church, and he just looks like he gives the place and all those gathered a sense of honor. He's the go-to guy for the fix-it jobs and knows all about the furnace, the AC, and the electrical system. Now, while he's not technical, he did help to install the projection system and knows how all of the wiring works. He's not the person who acts like he owns the church, if you have ever met one of those. I haven't here yet, but usually there's one or two around. And that they are the only one who can do things right. No, he's not like that at all. He's always teaching others and helping others to discover that no matter who they are, how old they are or young, there's a special place for them in the church. So you'll see him with a young child next to him shaking hands before worship, or you'll see him speaking to someone who's older in the church, quietly sitting. You know, that person who was so active and now their body makes it hard for them to do the things they used to do. And he's quietly telling them that they now have this very important role. That when they have those long hours at home by themselves, he's asking them to pray for the church and to pray for the meetings that happen during the week. He reads his Bible daily and attends the men's Bible study. He's not one to over-ask. He thinks very carefully before he approaches you, and so when he asks you to do something, you know that he's thought it through. He's thought about your gifts, your time, what's going on in your life, and the opportunity at the church. He gives more than 10% of his income, but doesn't make a single person feel uncomfortable because he has this very humble story about his giving. Well, that was Saul, the perfect churchgoer. When Saul became Paul, he became part of the leadership of the early Christian church. He was part of the many discussions about who could be a Christian and what a Christian did. Sometimes, as Christians now, it's hard to remember that they were figuring this all out. Was it important for those who followed Christ to still go to Sabbath on Saturday and then celebrate church on Sunday, the day that Christ rose? As well as all of the other questions that the early church had. Paul talks about Jewish law and continues to wrestle in this text over who belongs and who doesn't. Now, in the scripture, he uses the word justified over and over again. That, too, is a word that's not often used in daily conversations among Christians. In her reflection about this scripture, Mary Hinkle Shore provides an opportunity for us to help hear Paul's message in the scripture. She invites us to replace the word justified in the scripture with belong. So the questions of the scripture go like this. How do people know that they belong to the church? How do we know when we belong to the church and to God? And if we do belong to the church and God, how do others around us know that we are Christian? Now, we all have ways to identify who belongs. So I'm going to ask you a question, and I know you know the answer, at least probably half, so you can answer it, okay? How do you know who's an employee at Target? They wear red. How do you know if somebody's an employee at Walmart? They wear blue. See, you guys are so smart. When our kids were especially younger and we'd go somewhere, we'd tell them, if you get lost, look for the person, and then we would describe the uniforms of those at that particular event and tell them to look for a name tag. We use uniforms, we use things that people do to help identify who is and who is not in a particular group. For those who are graduating from high school and those who can remember way back then, I have to squeak my brain a little bit, you likely belonged to groups like sports or music or theater. Even in a particular class, there are class project groups. There are classes and groups of kids who tend to take classes together because that's how their class schedule works out. When you walk into a church, you can pick up clues about what larger church body the congregation belongs to. So if the congregation, the church you walk into, has kneelers, what do you usually think they are? Catholic. And if you walked into a church and you saw the Lutheran rose and you saw a picture of Martin Luther and they had the cranberry hymnals, what would you think that they were? I already gave it away. What? Lutheran. I'm so glad you could answer that one correctly. But let me tell you something. Out east and at Luther Seminary in St. Paul, all of the churches and chapels have kneelers. Isn't that interesting? So then it brings into question, well, how do we know what church is and what church isn't? I was just reading a book by former Bishop Charles Chilstrom, and he was telling about growing up. That's the section I've gotten through. He lived in a church where there were lived in a town with 3 Lutheran churches. And he said, if you would have asked me then what the difference was, he said it was beer. Because one church, the beer was openly delivered to the parsonage. The other church, people drank beer at their house, but only when they pulled the shades. And the third church, they didn't drink beer at all. In many churches, there are conversations about what does someone do or show that they belong to a church. What does someone do or show that they belong to Christ? As a young adult, I would have told you that a church member showed that they belonged by having attended Sunday school, vacation Bible school, that they were in Luther League, they probably went to camp, they worshiped every Sunday, even when out of town, that the adults in that church served on committees, the men and women washed dishes because that's where the most fun was, in the kitchen, and they were usually there at every church event, whether they were in charge or not, and everyone pitched in to help clean up. Now, many churches wonder if there are age groups of people who even care about church. Last night when I shared this, nobody nodded their head or acknowledged this, so I thought, well, maybe this isn't a conversation around here. But then quietly a few people said it is. I've heard people comment, actually someone who works with churches, that younger people are more interested in technology than church, and they're way too busy with their kids with traveling sports teams. when I was at that table, one particular day, and a group of pastors were having that conversation, I said, I'd like to share with you some amazing experiences I have had since my family has moved to Wisconsin. And I'm sure this happens in Minnesota too. There were things, and this continues to happen, more than one birthday party that my kids have been invited to where it says, don't bring a gift, please bring something for the food pantry. I never was invited to a party like that. And I never made that part of my birthday parties growing up. I can't tell you how many times I've heard about another story of giving at the school. And this is both elementary schools and middle schools and high schools where something happened with the whole school because of an idea that came up with a student. Where the whole school gathers old shoes to be sent to a particular group in need. Where the whole school has a penny war to be sent to those who are doing a walk for one thing or another. Over and over, I see whole schools coming together to learn about others in need in their communities and around the world and find ways to give and support them. I don't remember one single time that the whole school growing up did any kind of service thing. Now, there were maybe a few groups who did something here or there, and oftentimes it was go to the local care center, which is very important, but not the whole school, not the whole class. I've never heard of somebody inviting their neighbors over to their house to help make sandwiches to be delivered into the cities for those on the streets. I never heard of that. But that's happening now in communities. Not through any particular organization, just a bunch of neighbors inviting them over. I have been absolutely humbled and have great admiration and continue to try to find ways to incorporate what I've seen in several families who do things like that, or their kid chooses to go to Feed My Starving Children for their birthday party. And the parents are constantly talking about how the kids are looking for opportunities to give to others, or the parents are involved looking for opportunities to teach them about how to care for others. And I'm amazed. These are busy families. Well, when I shared this at the table with other pastors, of course, they didn't really believe me. And then they said, well, those are just your friends. And I said, no, these aren't my friends. These are people I've just met, and some of them don't belong to any church at all. Then I had another experience. I was at Target headquarters, and that's a whole nother interesting story. And I learned that Target has optional interest groups. Like if you want to get together and you're looking to further your career in business, and maybe you're looking at getting more college, so there's a group that works together that way. There are ski groups, there are golf groups, and then there is a Christian group. Formal Christian group that is approved by Target. And they work to make sure that they're inclusive. And I was amazed. So I started to ask, well, how did this come about? And they shared with me that there were all kinds of Bible studies going on. And it was not unusual when you joined Target that someone would quietly say, I belong to a Bible study here, and we meet on Thursdays at 2:00. During the workday. Or we meet right after work or lunch or different times. and it was already going on. So now that it's become more formalized, once a month over lunch hour, they bring a business person in from around the community or outside the community to share about their faith and their work. They do service projects together. I had no idea that that existed. And they shared with me that's in several large corporations. So I went around the table with the group of leaders and I asked their story. One had not been a Christian really at all and became more faithful through this Bible study and then joined a church. Another person was, every once in a while churchgoer and then really got into their faith. Another woman said, I'm very active in the church, so I'm not quite as active here, but I just do a Bible study. So I looked at all of them because they were all connected to a church and I'm a curious person. I said, have any of you told your pastor about this? And they all kind of looked at me like, why? No. Oh my goodness. As a pastor, and you'll have to ask Pastor Artie when you see him next, I would have been so excited to hear about that. And I would have said, can you share about that in church? Because there might be someone else for God is stirring to figure out a way to be able to join with others in Bible study, and the times don't work at church, and they've met a few people. I would have been so excited to hear about that and hear about God working outside the church walls, but profoundly in the world. Another woman I met said, I've lived in this community, not this one, for 12 years. She said, I had no idea what that church really did. And on top of all that, I don't know if you've noticed, driving by a lot of churches, it says, all are welcome, and the parking lot's empty. Like, what are we doing? Think about that when you drive around. Welcome to what? Well, we all say, to Sunday morning worship, right? Now, I want to let you know I'm a very traditional person. I remember the change from everyone using one common cup to individual cups. Now, that's probably long, long past in people's memory, but I remember kind of being bothered by that. I tend to dress up on Sundays because I like to. And in fact, sometimes when I've interviewed at churches, they've said, do you always wear a suit and dress up that much? Because, we're not sure about that. I'm like, no, but this is an interview, so this is what I do. I don't expect other people to dress up. In fact, one summer, a retired guy was ushering with another gentleman, and the other gentleman was giving this retired guy a really hard time about wearing shorts. And behind that teasing was this expectation that you had to dress a certain way at church. Well, I stepped in and said the shorts were just fine. It was the welcome, the kindness, and the involvement that were more important than the clothes. Your congregation is ordering t-shirts, and it'll be interesting for you to come back and see what you hear when you wear those. And some things you may not hear, but people will notice and put pieces together about those who are connected here. How do we know who belongs and who doesn't? How do we really know what it means to be a faithful Christian and what it means not to? Those expectations I had when I was younger, well, those expectations just got added on to as I was contemplating what it would mean to serve as a pastor. And they included things like knowing Scripture really well, knowing theology and the history of the church really well, praying on a very regular basis and being faithful about that, daily reading Scripture and being faithful about that, always being kind and courteous. And you know what? I didn't want to be a pastor because I couldn't do those things. And you know what? I still can't do all those things. Now, I wish I could, and I try to at times find a way to involve those pieces of faith life in my life. And it's not something I'm proud of when I tell you that I don't regularly do those things. I tell you that because no matter what I do, I can't match up to my own expectations, let alone the expectations of others, of what it means to be a Christian. I don't know if you have ever battled with expectations. If you have ever struggled and thought, oh man, I wish I was a better father. Or I wish I would have spent the time I'm spending with my grandkids with my own children. Or wow, that teacher, if I could just teach like they did. Or that person who works at the store, they always are positive. Oh, I wish I had that. Man, that person who's always serving in a variety of events, I just admire them. We are called to do things, and we are called to always find opportunities to grow. But when we have those moments, when we realize, at least for me, maybe none of you, but when I realize that I can't even meet my own expectations, let alone some others, well, that's when the law comes down on me. We don't always think of expectations as the law, but that's when the law comes down on me and says, you can't do it. Someone once said to a congregation, I just want to let you know, we're all out of perfect pastors. And on the flip side, to pastors who were looking for congregations, just want to let you know, we're all out of perfect congregations. So reading back into Galatians towards the end, it says, for through the law I died to the law so that I might live to God. I've been crucified with Christ, and so it is no longer I who live, but it is Christ who lives in me. I love the stories of the unexpected times when God pushes you a little or push someone else you didn't expect a little, and there's a time of sharing faith that you never would have predicted. Or you offer words and you think, man, I'm not exactly sure where these words are coming from. And the person later comes back and says how meaningful your words or your care was. That's Christ living in you. Paul continues, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. Faith is not a verb, it's a noun. Faith is something we are given from God. And when we attend worship, when we study the Bible, when we serve others, when we listen, when we share our doubts and questions, we are unwrapping this wonderful package of faith that God has given us. So I invite you this week to kind of think through, what does it mean to belong to a church? What does it mean to belong to God, to be a child of God? And how do others see? How do others see and know that I am part of God's gift, and I see them as a gift of God as well?